The door opened on a house that looked, at first, almost normal. Rossmore stepped inside, called out, heard nothing. He moved toward the staircase. He went up. He reached the first bedroom door and pushed it open. And whatever version of the world he had walked in with, he never got it back. 8 people were dead, all of them in their beds. All of them attacked in the dark, in their sleep, by someone who had moved through that house with a patience that would take investigators decades to understand and never fully explain. By the time the sun was fully up over Villisca, Iowa on June 10, 1912, the town that woke up that morning was not the same town that had gone to sleep the night before. And it never would be again. Now here's what you need to know about Villisca to understand why this hit the way it did. This was not a city. This was not a place where violence was an accepted background noise of daily life. Villisca in 1912 was a tight, quiet Iowa community of around 2,500 people, the kind of town where a main street hardware store and a couple of churches formed the center of everything. Farmers drove in on weekday mornings. Kids ran between yards. Doors weren't always locked because locking them felt almost rude, like you were announcing you didn't trust your neighbors. The unspoken trust in a place like Villisca was built on the assumption that people were basically decent, that the rhythms of life, work, church, family, sleep, were reliable. That trust had just been obliterated. Josiah Moore was 43 years old and ran a farm implement business in town. He was the kind of man other men trusted with handshake deals, reliable, well-regarded, embedded in the community in the way that takes years to build. His wife, Sarah, 39, was the quiet engine behind the household, the woman who organized the church events, remembered everyone's birthdays, made the daily life of a family of 6 function with the kind of competence that doesn't get celebrated until it's gone. Their 4 children were growing up in what appeared to be one of the safest places in America. Herman was 11. Catherine was 9. Boyd was 7. Paul was 5 years old. On the evening of June 9th, the family had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a warm summer event with singing and performances and the simple warmth of being surrounded by people you've known your whole life. 2 girls from a neighboring family came home with the Moores afterward for a sleepover. Lena Stillinger was 12. Her younger sister Ina was 8. It was the kind of spontaneous, ordinary decision that happens 1,000 times in small towns on warm summer evenings. Nobody thought twice about it. They all went to bed. The lamps went down. And then something entered that house that had no business being there. The axe found at the scene belonged to Josiah Moore. It hadn't been taken from a barn, as many believe, but from the coal shed in the backyard. Whoever killed those 8 people had walked onto the property, located the axe in that outbuilding, carried it inside, and used it. They used the blunt end, the pole, not the blade. Every victim had been struck multiple times. The attacks had been delivered while everyone slept, room by room, in a sequence that suggested complete control. Nobody ran. Nobody raised an alarm loud enough to reach the neighbors. The entire thing happened in silence and darkness, and by the time it was over, the killer had put the axe down and begun doing something that no one who has studied this case has ever been fully able to explain. They washed up. A basin of bloody water was found in the kitchen. A 2-pound slab of uncooked bacon, wrapped in a dishcloth, was discovered in the downstairs bedroom near the axe, removed from the icebox for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained. The windows had been covered with clothing and towels, the mirrors draped throughout the house. None of this was done in a hurry. The killer had moved through the home, committed 8 murders, cleaned up, covered the windows, and then, at some point, at some unhurried pace, walked out the door and disappeared into the Iowa night. When Mary Peckham knocked on the door the next morning and got no answer, Rossmore arrived with his key. By the time he pushed that door open, the person responsible had been gone for hours, and they had left behind a scene that would generate more theories, more suspects, more arguments, and more unanswered questions than almost any other murder case in American history. The investigators who descended on Villisca in the days that followed were dealing with a problem that had already been created in the first hours after discovery. Because here is something that gets lost in the telling of historical true crime cases. In 1912, nobody knew how to preserve a crime scene. There was no protocol, no forensic team waiting with evidence bags. When word spread that something had happened at the Moore house, people came. Neighbors, townspeople, county officials, curious strangers from surrounding areas. Dozens of people walked through that house before anyone with real investigative authority secured it. Footprints were destroyed. Whatever trace the killer had left behind was buried under the evidence of everyone who came to look. The contamination was catastrophic and irreversible. Within hours of the discovery, the physical record of what had happened inside that house had been compromised beyond recovery. Whoever killed 8 people in Villisca had been handed, entirely by accident, one of the most significant investigative advantages possible. The search for answers eventually fell to a private detective named James Newton Wilkerson. He would spend years of his life obsessed with this case. Years of interviews, theories, dead ends, reversals, and relentless reworking of whatever evidence remained. Of the hundreds of leads Wilkerson and local police chased, 2 names kept rising to the top. 2 suspects who represented 2 entirely different paths of investigation. The first path led directly to a traveling preacher who had been in town that very night, a man named Lynn George Kelly. Kelly was not a local. He was itinerant, the kind of minister who moved between congregations, stayed in people's homes, passed through towns, and kept moving. He had attended the same Children's Day program at the Presbyterian church that the Moore family had attended. He had been seen in conversation with Josiah Moore that evening. And then, early the next morning, before the bodies were found, before any alarm had been raised, before a single person in Villisca knew that anything was wrong, Kelly had boarded a train and left. That departure is where all the suspicion starts. In a community paralyzed by what had happened, Kelly was already gone. He said he had obligations elsewhere, another congregation expecting him. But that explanation never fully satisfied investigators, and it never fully satisfied the public following the case through newspaper coverage across the country. Think about what that timing means. Every person in Villisca who heard the news was rooted to the spot, unable to process it, unable to look away. And this man, who had been there that night, who had spoken with the victim just hours before, was already on a train heading somewhere else. Before the bodies were even found, Wilkerson built a case against Kelly that went beyond the timing of his departure. He pointed to Kelly's personal writings and sermons, arguing that recurring themes, blood, spiritual purification, violence as a form of divine cleansing, revealed an inner world significantly darker than his public ministry suggested. There were claims, disputed and contested, that Kelly had made statements amounting to a near confession during a conversation with another minister while in custody. Kelly denied everything. He denied it calmly, consistently, with the kind of steadiness that his supporters pointed to as evidence of innocence, and his detractors found almost more unsettling than outright panic would have been. He was arrested in 1917 and went to trial that September. The jury deadlocked 11-1 in favor of acquittal, sending the case right back to court. The second trial followed in November 1917 and ended in full acquittal. Kelly walked free. He was never convicted. He continued his ministry for years afterward, maintaining until the end of his life that he had nothing to do with what happened in Villisca. And yet the profile, a solitary, traveling man, present for the event and gone before the consequences, operating from an internal logic that investigators could never fully decode, has kept serious researchers returning to his name for over a century. But then there's the second suspect. And the second suspect changes everything about how you understand this case. Frank F. Jones was not a drifter. He was not an outsider. He was a fixture of Villisca, a successful businessman, a state senator, a man embedded in the exact same community establishment that Josiah Moore was part of. And he and Josiah Moore had a history that had quietly curdled into something genuinely dangerous. Moore had once worked for Jones, selling farm equipment under his business umbrella, and had been one of his most effective salespeople. When Moore left Jones's operation to start his own competing business, he took client relationships with him, relationships that Jones had spent years building and considered his own. By 1912, the two men were commercial rivals, and people who knew both of them said the atmosphere between them had moved beyond professional friction into something more personal, more bitter, more corrosive than a simple business dispute on paper ever sounds. Wilkerson, after years of pursuing Kelly, eventually turned his focus toward Jones. He constructed a theory that Jones had arranged for a hired killer, a man named William Mansfield, to eliminate Moore. Mansfield was a traveling salesman with a violent background who had come to Wilkerson's attention through a series of axe murders in other states that bore disturbing methodological similarities to Villisca. His own wife, child, and in-laws had been killed in Blue Island, Illinois. Same type of attack, same blunt force delivery during sleep, same apparent composure in the aftermath. The pattern was hard to dismiss. A man connected to multiple axe killings, linked through Wilkerson's investigation to a local businessman who had every reason to want Josiah Moore gone. But here is where the Jones theory runs into a massive, undeniable roadblock. William Mansfield had an alibi, not a vague, unverifiable claim. Actual payroll records that placed him working in Illinois at the exact time of the Villisca murders. Verified documentation, the kind of evidence that doesn't bend easily to theory. Wilkerson disputed its significance. Others found it decisive. Mansfield was never charged. Jones was never charged. And the conspiracy, compelling as its outline is, has never been able to clear that fundamental hurdle. So here is where the case lands. More than 100 years later, two suspects, both plausible, neither convicted, neither definitively eliminated. A crime scene destroyed within hours of discovery. Evidence processed with tools and understanding that belonged to a completely different era. A town that changed permanently in a single night and has spent over a century trying to make sense of what happened inside one house on East 2nd Street. The Moore house still stands. It operates today as a museum. But for those looking for something that can't be found in the daylight, it's also an overnight destination. Visitors arrive with cameras and recording equipment, paying to spend the night in the rooms where a family went to sleep and didn't wake up. The town has a monument in its cemetery bearing the names of all 8 victims: Josiah Moore, Sarah Moore, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena Stillinger, Ina Stillinger. Paul was 5 years old. Ina was 8. These were kids who went to a church program on a summer evening, came home warm and tired and happy, and crossed paths with something that should never have found them. Their names are on stone now. Their story is still being told. And the person who took everything from them walked out of that house in the Iowa dark and was never, not in any court, not in any official record, held responsible for any of it. The case is open. The suspects are dead. The evidence is gone. And the question of who entered the Moore house on the night of June 9th, 1912 remains exactly where it has always been. Unanswered, unresolved, and somehow, impossibly, still alive. That's what makes this case different from most. It's not just that we don't know who did it. It's that we came so close. 2 trials, years of investigation, 2 credible suspects with documented connections to that night, and still walked away with nothing. No conviction, no closure, no final answer for the families, for the town, for the 8 people who deserved at least that much. Whoever did this got away with it. Completely. And that fact, more than anything else about the Villisca axe murders, is the one that refuses to leave you alone.